If you play poker for real money, you need a bankroll. Very simple. But how big of a bankroll do you need? That's going to depend on a bunch of factors. We're going to talk about all of those today and give you some tips for managing your bankroll even better. Let's get started. Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today we're going to talk about your bankroll. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's start with a very basic definition. A bankroll is the money you have set aside for playing poker, and it should be exclusively set aside, which means you should have your real life money and you should have money that you have for playing cards. If you don't have that right this moment, I would definitely suggest thinking about your money this way. Now, of course, things are going to change a little bit if you're a professional player versus a more casual player. If you're a professional player, you 100% need a bankroll, especially if poker is your only source of income. You 100% need to make sure that you have enough money to withstand the variance of this game. If you're a more casual player, you play a couple times a month, whatever it is, then having a purely dedicated bankroll isn't as important, but it's still something that you want to be considering, especially if you want to take poker more and more seriously. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's get into some tips for managing your bankroll even better. Tip number one is to make sure that you have a proper number of buy-ins. Now, a proper number of buy-ins is going to be dependent on two major variables. One, do you primarily play cash games or tournaments? And two, do you play professionally or do you play more recreationally and casually? Alright, so let's just knock these out in order. If you play cash games casually, again non-professionally, then the general rule is 20 buy-ins, which means if you play 25 cent, 50 cent online, and you buy in for $50 on average, then you should multiply that by 20 and have a $1,000 bankroll to play that limit. If you are a casual tournament player, the average buy-in is about $100 for your typical bankroll. So if you typically buy in for $5, you play $5 tournaments online or whatever it is, times that by 100 and you should have a $500 bankroll to play that game. Now, tournaments can be a little bit weird with all the different kinds of formats and add-ons and all the different things you're going to find spread across different tournaments around the world. So if you typically say buy in for $5, but then you also always add a $5 add-on or whatever it is, then your average buy-in is closer to $10. So again, take that 10, multiply it by 100 for a $1,000 bankroll. This is the general way to start when thinking about playing things casually. Now, if you play either of these formats professionally, if it's really your main source of income, then as a conservative estimate, I would just tap a 0 on the back of either of those numbers. So if you're primarily a professional cash game player, 200 buy-ins. If you are a professional tournament player, roughly 1,000 buy-ins is a pretty darn conservative way to go. And if you're wondering why you even want a bankroll, especially a bankroll so large as say 1,000 buy-ins, the reason why we want to think about it that way is to lower our risk of ruin. So there is a lot of variance baked into this game. You will have bankroll drawdowns. So just take a crazy example where you have a single buy-in bankroll, right, which is absurd, and you end up getting aces, and you get aces all in pre-flop. Well, that's great, but some percentage of the time you're going to lose with that hand. So you don't want to put yourself in a situation where it only takes a single loss for you to be completely out of the game. That's not a great way to think about it. So you want to make sure that you have a bankroll that can support the general drawdowns and general variance of the game, which is, 20 buy-ins is okay. Some chunk of the time, some players are going to go and drill all the way through 20, which is why if you play professionally, you have to make sure you have enough money to withstand buy-ins and downswings that can reasonably happen. If you can't do that and you get busted out of the game and it's your only source of income, that is a real problem. So that's really what bankrolls in general are trying to help mitigate, is some of that risk of ruin, because we really don't want that. Alright, tip number 2 is for the non-pros, and that is to make sure that you set a budget if you aren't already. Now, the thought process here is that if you are not a pro, if you're playing this game more recreationally, you are making money from other sources of income, like a job. And as such, if you, say, drop a couple of buy-ins playing cards, that's okay, because you can always just replenish it from a paycheck and it's not a problem. But make sure to set a budget. Understand what your budget can afford, and that's going to be based upon, obviously, your income and your cost of living and all those other different factors and facets. So think about what you can reasonably afford to spend or put into playing cards in a given month or between paychecks or whatever it ends up being. Make sure that this is kind of a low-end estimate. Be conservative here. You don't want to be blasting off 25% of your overall income on poker, especially if you are a losing player right this moment. So be reasonable with it and pick a number that works again for you and your current budget. Tip number 3 is to actually separate your personal and your poker finances. Now, part of this tip is just for general tracking and being able to say, okay, here's the current size of my bankroll right this moment, and being able to say, okay, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it playing pretty steady? And you can make decisions about your bankroll from there, and we'll talk a little bit about shots later in the video, but essentially it's really, really nice if you can separate this, especially if you can do it physically, be it just a separate bank account or just making sure that you have your money in different online sites and you can quickly check your balances on those. Having some separation between those two things can help a tremendous amount, especially when you keep that in mind with the next tip. And tip number 4 is to consider all of your buy-ins gone. Now, this one might be a little bit more of just a mental framing technique, but I think it's very, very important, which means that if you buy into a tournament, consider that buy-in gone. Totally gone. If you deposit into a poker site, consider it totally gone. If you pull out money from an ATM to go play live poker, consider that cash totally gone. Now, when I was growing up, my grandmother would always tell me to look at gambling the same way you look at going to a movie. You're going to spend money and you're going to get zero money back. You're just paying for the experience. In the event of gambling, if you make any money, great. That's just complete icing on the cake. But your whole thing is that you're not expecting to make money and you're expecting actually to lose it all. So if you take this mental model, essentially what happens is that any money you make in a session is totally great. Even if you say buy in for $200 and you just mentally saying, okay, well, I'm down $200, that's never going to belong back to me, and you end up losing $150 on the session, well, you're actually plus 50 compared to, again, your complete negative $200 to start it. Again, a little bit of a mental tip, but I find it very, very helpful for framing out buying into poker in the first place. But other than the mental trick part of this, if the idea that money being gone creates any sort of pain, you should not be playing poker right this moment. That's simple. Poker is not a solution for money problems. So most players are going to lose in the long run. It's very important to remember that. And even winning players will lose a good chunk of the sessions that they play. So if you cannot handle that at the moment, do not play. Please be responsible here. Alright, tip number 5 is to make sure that you keep solid records of your poker bankroll. I believe it was Drucker who said you can't manage that which you don't measure, and you have to measure your bankroll, and the best way to do it is by keeping solid records. Make sure you know what your bankroll is right this moment, how things are going, how things have been going for a while, what your overall wins are in certain places, where you're losing. These are very important things. The more you play, the more you definitely want to have very, very solid records, and if you're a pro, you definitely need solid records, especially if you're in a country that taxes your gambling winnings. And these don't need to be incredibly complex records, really just needs to be where you played, how long you played for, total wins, total losses, all that kind of fun stuff is great. If you play live, I definitely suggest the PokerStack app, very, very good, especially, I know it works on iOS, I don't know if it works on Android, but if you play online poker, I would definitely suggest looking into Poker Tracker 4 if you're on a site that allows you to use that. Again, you have to make sure that you are monitoring and tracking your bankroll, and these are the best ways to do it that are very easy. And if you're on a site or a place where this just simply is not an option, then a simple Excel sheet is going to be just fine. Just make sure to keep track of it. Now, tip number 6 is to consider stop losses. So a stop loss means that essentially before a session, you're going to say, okay, if I lose this amount of money, I'm going to completely quit the session right that moment. Very, very simple. And the whole goal of this is to keep small losses from spiraling into bankroll burners. And this is more and more important as you have tilt issues, as you have kind of the mental game issues going on in your game, then these become more and more important. And they can be very helpful, especially if it's like, okay, I know if I lose 3 buy-ins and I'm going to start playing like utter crap, then yeah, put in some sort of stop loss to make sure that doesn't happen and make sure to adhere to it. You 100% have to, otherwise this is just wasted words and wasted effort. Now, this is a little more difficult to do if you are an online player, but if you're a live cash game player, you can just bring the amount of cash that you want to set as your stop loss, and once you lose it, you're done. Leave your ATM card in the car and just call it a day. If you end up burning through all the cash you bring with you, then you're done for the day. Very, very simple. Now, with all that said, I don't typically suggest stop losses for disciplined, serious players, and the reason is they can pull you out of very, very good games and spots. So let's just say you're in an extremely fishy game, action is very, very good, good, you have huge edges in this game, and you happen to say get some big hands in pre-flop, and you happen to get sucked out on a couple of different times. So you end up hitting whatever 2 or 3 arbitrary buy-in stop loss you would have hit. But the game is so incredibly good that by getting pulled out of that, you'd actually miss a massive bankroll opportunity. So if you have the discipline to make sure your edges are still actually that solid and you can play through it and the mental isn't beating into you and degrading your edges in any real capacity, then again, that's a situation where I might skip the stop loss. But if you're still working on the mental aspects of things, a stop loss can be a very good idea. And that brings us to our final bankroll tip, and that is to take more shots. So if you paid careful attention to the suggestions earlier in terms of size of bankroll, you may have noticed this kind of like weird gray zone, right? Where you might have quite a few buy-ins for your current limit, maybe more than you need, but you don't quite have 20 at the next limit up. This is where taking shots becomes really important, so that way you don't just wait until you have the arbitrary 20 for the next limit, then all of a sudden move up, and if you lose 1 or 2 buy-ins, then you're kind of in this like awkward zone, especially if you are grinding at a limit that is too low that you need to be moving up and out of very quickly, especially if that limit has really horrific rake, which most micros and smaller live games tend to have. And if you're looking for my general rule on exactly how to start taking these shots, use the 15-2 rule. Leave a link for it right up there. Watch that. It's a very good video and will run you through exactly how to think about taking shots in your game. Seriously, go watch it now. See you over there in a moment.